we had a lot of very good cover crops over the winter period, and they will have taken up a lot of nitrogen. But I suppose the problem is trying to predict how much of that nitrogen will become available to the crop and can be used to reduce your fertiliser and inputs is really, really difficult. And most of the work that I've done looking at that particular question has suggested that for the majority of cover crops, you get very little nitrogen back into the next crop. The one difference is where you've a lot of legume in your cover crop, then you can get a significant amount of nitrogen into the next crop. But again, predicting how big that amount is quite difficult.
Nitrogen is arguably the most important input in agriculture. Costs have risen by more than 25% in recent weeks since the outbreak of the conflict in Iran. Luckily, many tillage farmers have already pre-bought most of their requirements before the price increases. It's unclear whether these prices will return to previous levels, so getting the best value from every euro spent should be a priority for every farmer this year. You're listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. If you're enjoying the series, we'd really appreciate it if you could follow the podcast and leave a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts from. Tailoring nitrogen rates to individual crops and individual fields is essential to maximise returns. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Richie Hackett, a researcher who's been researching nitrogen inputs on a range of crops for the past 20 years here in Teagasc. Richie, fertiliser prices have increased by 20 to 25% over the last couple of weeks. Is there a point where it's uneconomic to apply nitrogen to crops?
Well, I think you're always going, if you sow a crop, you're always going to use some nitrogen, but it's a question of how much. And there does come a point where you need to stop, and we call that the economic optimum. And the Teagasc recommendations would be based on that point. But as fertilizer price increases, the economic optimum usually decreases if as long as grain price stays the same. So given that fertilizer price has increased, maybe growers should start to think about maybe reducing their fertilizer amounts a little bit. But I suppose the thing about it is that talking to some growers in over the last few weeks, some of them had a lot of their nitrogen bought or a lot of their fertilizer bought before the prices went up. Some had a good share of it, but maybe not all of it. And then some had very little bought. So there's a range of different growers out there. Those that had all their nitrogen purchased before the price increase probably don't need to make any changes. For those that are buying the more expensive fertilizer, yes, maybe they should think about reducing their fertilizer amount a little bit, but in terms of nitrogen, 5-10 kilos a hectare, maybe at most. And I suppose the other point we need to think about is it all depends really on the relationship between fertilizer price and grain price. If both go up, you don't really need to change anything, but unfortunately at the moment the grain price hasn't really increased, whereas the fertilizer price has. But that could well change between now and harvest when most growers sell their grain.
Sure, I can remember we had a very similar conversation with the outbreak of the last war, Richie, and I suppose the way the grain prices went in the end, it wasn't really the time to reduce nitrogen. So it's a bit of a wait and see, but it's we probably have to spend a bit before we get something back. I suppose it'll be too late if people wait too long.
Yeah, it's really difficult, as I say, when we don't know what the grain price that most growers are going to sell at is. It's really difficult to give definitive advice on it.
Okay, so going back to maybe something that we do know about, Richie, it was a very wet winter. It certainly seemed like a very long wet winter. There was a lot of rain there. And does that make any difference then to the nitrogen recommendations for the year that comes by? Like, is the soil a bit washed out, or are there other kind of major factors that might come into it a bit more, such as maybe the frequent use of organic manures, or there was a legume crop in the previous crop or something like that?
Well, certainly any nitrate that was in the soil over the winter period is likely to be gone at this stage. But I'm not sure that the high rainfall this year would have made a lot of difference, because in most years, most of the nitrate that's in the soils is going to be leached out over the winter period anyway, because we always have wet winters, and I would argue that our soil mineral N at the beginning of the growing season in Ireland is low in most years. unless we get a very, very dry winter, which we rarely get these days. So I would say that the rainfall probably doesn't make a huge difference in terms of our recommendations. We certainly have no data to support changing our recommendations based on rainfall levels. The other things that you mentioned, the manure history, certainly if a field is getting a lot of organic manures on a repeated basis, year after year after year, that is going to build up your organic matter, and that will build up the amount of nitrogen that's being released from the soil. And then you can reduce your fertilizer inputs. Things like cover crops. We had a lot of very good cover crops over the winter period this past winter, and they will have taken up a lot of nitrogen. But I suppose the problem is trying to predict how much of that nitrogen will become available to the crop and can be used to reduce your fertilizer and inputs is really, really difficult. And most of the work that I've done looking at that particular question with cover crops has suggested that you get, for the majority of cover crops, you get very little nitrogen back into the next crop. The difference is where you've a lot of legume in your cover crop, then you can get a significant amount of nitrogen into the next crop. But again, predicting how big that amount is quite difficult.
Yeah, so there's lots of complex factors in it. We might maybe turn just a little bit, I suppose, maybe in kind of, seeing as a grower might have a nitrogen amount in mind. And in terms of trying to split out that nitrogen, Richie, how much of that would, I suppose, at this stage of the year when people are still maybe planting spring barley, how much of that would you recommend that goes into the seed bed versus going back top dressing afterwards?
I think the amount going into the seed bed will be to a certain extent dictated by the compound that the grower has. But typically you'd be putting in at least 30 or 40 kilos per hectare of nitrogen into the seed bed. And some growers will put in more. I believe there are some growers that at this stage are putting all their nitrogen into the seed bed. I'm not sure there's any benefit to that. Any of the work that we've done looking at putting all the nitrogen into the seed bed versus putting some on, up to mid tillering, has shown that there's absolutely no difference in terms of either yield or protein content when you put the nitrogen on. So yeah, and particularly given that we're in a very catchy year in terms of getting drilling days, I'm not so sure I'd be parking up the drill to go back and put on the nitrogen as well as the compound on my seed bed. So I suppose to answer your question, I think if I had 30 or 40 kilos of nitrogen in the seed bed, I'd be happy, and then I can put the rest on when the crop emerges or up to the mid tillering stage, and I wouldn't have any worries about that.
Okay, and talking about putting enough or maybe too much on, is there any limitation in terms of the amount of P or K that a farmer could apply, basically with a combine drill, say, just particularly just around the seed? Is there any limitation there, or that would interfere with the seed germinating?
Yeah, well, I suppose that the limitation might be with the K part of it. The P part of it isn't really a problem, but the K part can be quite salty, particularly if it's muriate of potash that's in the compound. And typically, 75, 80 kilos per hectare is sort of what you would suggest. You may well get away with a lot more than that, but you start to run into maybe some risk of slight salt injury if you put on much more than that. You would also have to be careful if you're with high levels of nitrogen going down with the seed bed, because it can have, going down with the seed being placed next to the seed, it can have some negative effects as well.
Okay, I was just thinking there as you were talking there about the people going out and trying to put all of their nitrogen into the seed bed, and perhaps that's come from other years where seed beds got very dry thereafter, and they were kind of worried about nitrogen not getting, I suppose, into that crop. Do you think that's a worry? Maybe in this year's, maybe in specifically, but do you think that's a worry in a general sense?
The research would suggest not. So we would have done some work like that in, say, in 2018, which is a very dry year, and we found no difference between putting. We didn't put all the nitrogen in, but we put a large portion of the nitrogen in some of the plots, and very little of the nitrogen in other plots, and top dressed it, and we found no difference. And it was actually, there was some work being done in the UK at the same time where they were putting all the nitrogen in the seed bed versus treatments where they were putting nitrogen on, two or three times during the season. And in some of their trials, they got no rain between sowing and harvest, or virtually no rain between sowing and harvest. And they couldn't show a benefit, a direct benefit of putting all the nitrogen in the seed bed. There was very little difference between plots that got all the nitrogen in the seed bed versus plots that would have got nitrogen top dressed as well. So the research doesn't really back it up. I
Okay.
think so. I wouldn't be worried about not having all my nitrogen in the seed bed.
I suppose maybe Richie, it probably stems maybe a little bit from the fact that people put on the nitrogen and they come back a week, 10 days, 2 weeks, maybe even 3 weeks later, and you can still see the granules on the ground, and they kind of say, well, geez, the nitrogen hasn't got anywhere there. Geez, I'm not getting the benefit at all of it. Is that actually the case, or are our soils in an arid context damp enough that nitrogen is going to get down into the soil?
Well, I suppose the ideal situation is when you top dress fertilizer that you get, 10 to 15 millimeters of rain in the week or 10 days after applying it. But that obviously doesn't happen. But what does happen is there will always be some moisture in the soil, and that will link up with the granule, and it will, the nitrogen, particularly from products like CAN, will move into the soil. But what's left behind often is the filler, which is in case of CAN limestone, which obviously needs a lot more water to dissolve compared to the nitrogen. So we've put nitrogen as CAN on very dry soils on crops that were very, very hungry. And you would think that, as you said, you come back 10 days later and the granules are still visible, but you can see that the crop has greened up in trials. So that the crop was obviously getting some nitrogen from those granules.
So, Richie, as you were talking about the solid ones there, there's been a bit of a shift in lots of farmers out there to the liquid N applied by sprayers. Is there any advantages maybe or disadvantages to using liquid over solid in terms of that, what we're talking about there, the nitrogen getting into the plant or into the soil?
Yeah, well, for me, the main benefit of the liquid is the evenness of application that you get compared to trying to spread granules, particularly over wide tram lines. In terms of efficiency and in terms of getting into the crop quicker, I haven't seen any research to show that that's the case. Okay, the liquid is already dissolved, so you don't have to go through the dissolution process, whereas the can type products do have to do that. But in terms of getting into the soil, the amount of actual liquid that's going on is quite small. So how far it's getting into the soil is going to be quite limited. So I'm not sure there's a huge difference. Certainly in the trials we've done where we've compared liquid versus solid on spring barley or any of the other crops, even when it's going on dry crops or on dry soils, we see very little difference in yield or protein at the end of the season. So I would say they're both good products. I'm not so sure there's a benefit over one over the other in terms of agronomic efficiency, other than, as I said, the one that I mentioned in terms of evenness of application.
I might just move on just a little bit then in terms of some of the overall rates for the likes of spring wheat, spring oats, or maybe even spring barley. And for those crops? What's I suppose the tops of the nitrogen you'd put on, and what's the average that you'd kind of like to see most crops getting?
We start maybe with say spring oats. If you're sort of looking, if you're getting sort of 6.5 ton crops there, you're looking at maybe about 110 kilos per hectare. If you're getting higher yields, you can put on an extra 20 kilos per hectare for each additional a ton per hectare. In terms of the spring wheat, you're going to be looking at higher levels of nitrogen. So, for a 7.5 ton crop, which is your 3 ton an acre crop, you're looking at about 160 kilos per hectare of nitrogen. And obviously, as the spring wheat has been grown for milling, you have an additional 30 kilos per hectare of nitrogen you can apply to get your protein up. For spring barley, comes down to I guess the end use. So some growers will be will be growing for malting barley. So they will be looking to manage their proteins. So I guess typically about 150 kilos per hectare is what many growers would be looking at, and that will work well for your feed barley as well. Obviously, if you're getting higher yields, you'll be putting a bit more nitrogen on to sustain those higher yields. But 150 kilos per hectare would be sort of a common rate that's used by
Thereabouts.
many
Okay.
growers.
And Richie, is there any data to support the use of some of the in-season end testers, the chlorophyll meters or the sap testers or sensors or stuff like that to try and adjust the final nitrogen rate on the crops to try and maximize yield or quality?
I would say for spring crops, I wouldn't be convinced because everything happens so quickly, and it's quite difficult to get a measurement, and then at a sufficiently late stage in the season when the crop is actually able to tell you how it's doing, and get that measurement, and then go out and put on nitrogen. You're usually gone past the stage where you might put on nitrogen. For winter crops, maybe there's probably a bit more scope, but we don't have any data that I'm aware of that would support their use to actually adjust nitrogen levels in our crops here in this country.
So a good researcher's answer, there's more research needed. Is that it, Richie?
Probably is, but there is a lot. These have been tested a lot abroad as well, and they're not all that widely used for in many countries, as far as I can see. There is a cost involved with some of these instruments as well, which you need to factor into the equation. But certainly, yeah, it's something that could be merit further research.
And just on that, given the fact, I suppose, that people are trying new things, and we have a number of farmers out there who have I suppose reduced, or so they tell us at least, anyways, reduced their overall nitrogen input by switching to melted urea and spraying urea directly onto canopies. Is there anything to support that as maybe a newer approach or a better approach to going for a lower overall nitrogen input into cereals?
So the first thing I'd say is we know for a long time that foliar application of nitrogen, particularly urea products, can be an effective way of getting nitrogen into the crop. Relatively small amounts, that said, but it can be effective. In terms of the specific question you asked of using the melted urea, I suppose in the past a lot of the melt of urea would have been used late in the season to specifically to increase protein contents. But the scenario you're talking about is where it's being used to replace some of the base fertilizer, if you like.
Yeah.
And we did do a little bit of work on that last year, and what we found was that yes, you could get very good yields where you applied, where you reduced your base fertilizer and applied some of your nitrogen as melted urea. But what we did find was that I suppose one of the claims is that the melted urea, kilo melted urea, equals a multiple number of kilos of base fertilizer. But what we were finding was a kilo of fertilizer applied as foliar or melted urea was equivalent to 1 kilo of nitrogen applied as base fertilizer. So you weren't getting that multiplier effect. So, and where you put on less fertilizer, you were still getting good yields, but yields were slightly less than you would have got if you put the full rate, the normal rate of nitrogen on, and you were leaving a few euros behind you but by not putting on the full rate of nitrogen. But it's early days. we're only a limited amount of data available on that, so it's very difficult to be definitive on it. But I would say that yes, it can be an effective way to get nitrogen into the crop, but it's no more effective than putting on your base fertilizer as CAN or protected urea or whatever nitrogen source you're using.
Okay, good to know. So one final question for you, Richie, and I suppose, look, it's around the cost of nitrogen has gone up by maybe 25% over the last 3 weeks, and who knows how long it's going to take for that to go back down. Is there any advantage to farmers who are, every farm is probably individual in the extent that has a different amount of soil types and that kind of thing out there. Is there any merit in farmers out there trying to, I suppose, do their own small mini trials for the amount of nitrogen that's needed on their crops on their farms? And is there any particular way that you could suggest to them that how they might maybe monitor that along the line in terms of whether it's yield or grain protein or that kind of stuff? Is there any way they can, I suppose, the key to the question really is that they can optimize the nitrogen usage on their farm based on what they have on their farm?
I suppose it's particularly people using spinning disc type machines. It can be quite difficult to vary the amount of nitrogen they're putting on small strips or whatever. I suppose the ideal is to do it on lengths of tram line. And if I were going to do it, if I were going to advise a grower about how to do it, I think what you would do is you'd put on your normal rate and then another part of the field put on maybe 40 or 50 kilos less than what your normal rate is, and another part of the field 40 or 50 kilos more than your normal rate, and can you see a difference in yield between those. So you won't see differences, if you vary your nitrogen by 5 or 10 kilos a hectare, you won't see that difference in yield. We won't even see that difference in plot trials. So that might be a way of doing it. Just might be one way of doing it. In terms of trying to identify whether you're putting on enough or too much nitrogen on your crops, but it is quite difficult to do with fertilizer in on farm scale trials.
But it's something people might just be able to have a go at if they were, I suppose, concerned about that, or to kind of see where they are. Listen, Richie, thanks very much for your time. I know you're out in the field today. You might be getting rained off a little bit there now as I'm looking out the window, but thanks very much, and hopefully you'll get all the trials here in Oak Park that you want to get in. Thanks, Richie.
Thank you, Michael. So
that's it for this episode, and my thanks to Richie for joining me on the show. Teagasc are starting the spring crop walks next Wednesday, April the 15th in Carlow, where we will be discussing the agronomy of spring crops, and in particular how to cope with cost increases and also how to cope with wild oat herbicides. This event marks the first in a series of crop walks that will take place across the country, so keep an eye on teagasc.ie events page or messages from your local advisor. So finally, if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening. I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.